Now, before I start this, I need to make this clear. I was 11 years old at the time. That was a very plain and uninteresting guy all around. I haven't had any other experiences with creatures or the paranormal since this. And another thing, this lasted an entire week. What I'm about to tell you guys lasted from Monday all the way to the next Sunday. This happened over 8 years ago. I was in 6th grade at the time, and it was about midway through the year. We were all stressed, since the dreaded midterms were upon us and none of us were prepared. So all of our minds were completely addled from the random questions we were going to have to do. The day went by as uneventful as usual, save for teachers telling us to get ready and whatnot. School ended, and I decided that I was going to do anything that night to relax, thanks to the annoying teachers constantly pestering us about those tests. I went home and watched some TV. A few movies later, it was time to go to bed. And this is when it started. I was tucked into bed since I was a complete mama's boy and tried to go to sleep after the door was shut. Soon after, I heard the TV downstairs turn on, telling me my mom had sat down to watch TV. I tried to go to bed, but something was off. No sooner had I heard the TV turn on, I stopped hearing it, and I stopped hearing any other sort of noise coming from downstairs. This could usually be chalked up to my mom just going to bed. However, she would always turn the lights off. I could tell she hadn't gone to bed because I could still see all the lights on from under my door. As I wondered why I could no longer hear her, or anything from downstairs for that matter, I started to feel like I couldn't breathe. Scared, I tried to get up and move, call for help, to do anything to get someone's attention. I found out I couldn't move or make any sound, regardless of how hard I tried. My mouth would open, but nothing would come out. I strained to move, but it felt like my muscles had been paralyzed. They wouldn't respond to what I wanted them to do. As I lay there trying to get someone's attention, I saw it. There, by the closet door, was that thing. It was large, not muscular, and was actually very skinny, and I could almost see its bones. But its height was what grabbed my attention right off the bat. It was probably 6 or 7 feet tall, as it was clinging onto the door and was hunching slightly so as to not hit the ceiling. It had very pale skin. However, I could not make out any details on it exactly. Not that night anyways. The last thing I noticed about it was it had no face. It was just a blank slate, devoid of any features and devoid of any kind of hint as to why it was there. I looked at this thing, feeling what I imagine as a primal instinct that is found in anything that looks into something like this. It was fear. Not the kind of fear you get when you see your parents get into a fight. Not the kind of fear you have when looking at a wild predator, really. No, this is what I would imagine. The kind of fear you feel when you know that your life is at the whim of something altogether completely, horribly wrong. This thing stayed there, on the door, for hours. It never moved, not so much as an inch. It just stayed there and did nothing, just like how I could do nothing. As the hours passed and as the fear settled in, I could think to some degree. I realized that I had no idea what I was going to do. Mom would come in at 6:30 to wake me up, and this thing was still there, not making a sound or movement. The time was drawing nearer to when she was supposed to come and wake me up, and I began to panic. I tried to move, but I was still in that paralyzed state. I tried to scream, and nothing would come out. However, I could still see under my door, and I noticed that a shadow was walking up the stairs and towards it. I still couldn't do anything. But as the door opened and I glanced over to it, I immediately looked back, and that thing on the closet was gone. It vanished without a trace. When it was gone, it felt like I had control over myself again, save for one thing, and that being a strange feeling that I shouldn't tell anyone what happened. So when my mom opened the door and saw me, asking why I looked so pale, all I could say was, it was just a bad dream. You know, the one about the werewolves in the kitchen. Seeming to understand, or at the very least thinking she did, she came over and told me it was all right, and that monsters weren't real. I really wish that was true. I even went to school like normal. I forgot about what happened the night before. School ended, I got home, and I went outside to walk around the neighborhood. I was back home before dinner. I went upstairs to go to bed, having completely forgotten or maybe having wrote it off as a bad dream, and I tried to go to sleep. That night as well, however, it came again, and this time was almost the same as the night before. I lost all of my hearing, and then I could not speak, and finally I was unable to move a muscle. Same as before. And then there was that thing again. This time it had changed positions. Now it was further down the door, its knees bent backwards. It was crossing its arms, which I could tell from its new angle had claws on the end. This thing was now looking right at me, or at least it was pointed in my direction. And once again it stood silent and unmoving. This time I did not even try to do anything. I just looked at it, and I waited for it to do something. I waited, and thankfully did not do anything again, leaving in a similar fashion as the night before. This time when I left home to get to school, I did not forget about it. The day passed, and I still could not get this thing out of my head. I couldn't think of any reason why it would be there. I hadn't seen any horror movies in the last 3 months, and school wasn't stressing me out that bad. So what the reason was to this haunting or quite possibly stalking, I don't know. I still don't have an answer to it to this day. This happened every night though, and the only things that changed each night were its position towards me and how far away it was. The third night, it had left the door and positioned itself on the floor in between. It was squatting, looking like it was either trying to imitate a frog or prepare to launch itself into the air, towards me, with its claws extended. But it never did. On the fourth night, that primal fear almost went away. However, it got even closer, now picking its head over the end of my bed, with its hand actually on it. It stayed like that all night. And the next day, I tried to see if it had left some kind of mark on the floor on my bed, but there was nothing. Night 5 came, and it was now crouched on the end of my bed, being careful that it was not touching any part of the bed I occupied with my legs. Night 6, and it was no longer on my bed, but extremely close on the wall to my left, holding a position that looked like it was eyeing a toy or foreign object. Now, before I talk about the last night, as it is the hardest and most uncomfortable part for me to write about, let me say that I had tried to block it from getting closer each day before I went to bed. I would put coats in the closet, which made it leave the door. I tried to put a chair in between me and it from where it was at the night before, and it ended up pushed to the end of my bed. Needless to say, I stopped trying after that, thinking that I was inciting it to get closer each time, and I tried to do something else. That final night, it got close, and by close, I mean it had made sure its face was only a few inches from mine, so there was no way for me to see behind it. It used its arm and a leg on the wall to hold itself up, while the other arm was on the wall behind me and the other leg was bent and holding onto the right side of my bed. Not only did this thing position itself around me in a way that resembled a spider surrounding a fly in its web, there was also something else that was different. That night, I had control over myself. I could feel that I could move if I wanted to, or make a noise if I tried. I could even hear the TV downstairs still playing and my mom talking to my stepdad. However, even with this revelation, I made no attempt to do anything. As I looked at this thing up close, I could tell that it did actually have a face. However, the mouth, eyes, and what I think was a nose were all located behind its skin. That's also when I noticed that it was smiling with jagged and sharp teeth, at me. I felt that it knew I could move. It almost seemed like it was daring me to try. I didn't take up this bet, and I just waited like I usually did, now with the fresh wave of primal fear I had felt for the first 2 nights. It had no smell, and I half thought that this thing was made for the sole purpose of getting into a house and leaving no trace behind. As it continued to smile and make no movement or noise, I lost track of how many hours had gone by since I went to bed. At some point I realized that, once again, my mom was coming up the stairs to wake me up. But when I noticed this, it did too. Its smile got wider, and it was the only movement this thing had ever made so far. As the sound of footsteps got closer, I saw it disappear and then reappear right before my eyes, going from being point blank on top of me to being right on top of where the door my mom was opening. She opened it, and this time that thing did not leave. It made one final movement, a quick and yet slow motion of its clawed hand to its mouth. It looked like it was telling me, "Stay quiet," before it left from my sight. After it left, I didn't say a word about it for months, almost a year. I finally told my mother what had happened, and all she said to me was, "Don't worry, nothing in this house will ever hurt you." This should seem like a normal response for a mother to make, but I could have sworn that I saw her go a little pale after I told her. As a result, I wondered for the longest time. I wondered if she meant that there was nothing in the house that could hurt me or want to, or if she meant that even if there was something there, something she knew was there, that it still wouldn't hurt me, even though it very well could. After all of these years, I still don't know what that thing was. I've been told by some that it was just my mind going into overdrive because of stress, but even my mind could never create something as horrific as that. I've told others since then, and some say it was a demon that was just there to feed off of my fear. I have researched what it could be, and the closest things I've found that remotely resemble it would either be a skinwalker or maybe a wendigo. However, those still do not make sense, since those don't have their faces behind their skin. So, to this day, I still wonder what it was, and why it decided to stay around for so long and just do nothing. Was it a demon? Was it a creature from a horror story? Or just a figment of my imagination? One day I hope to find the answer to this, but I have a feeling it won't be for a long time. Call me crazy, but I don't feel like I've seen the last of this thing, and that it may eventually come seeking me out again. Only next time, it won't just stay there and wait for me to do something. Many of you may not believe this story, and honestly I'm having a bit of a hard time believing it myself. I live in a small community in the middle of an empty desert. My biological father is a bit of a menace. He has thrown several of my cats and some strays I used to feed into the desert. Several of them have not been seen or heard from again. Now, to the story. I recently began to hear one of my cats meows from the desert, and have taken my dog walking out there searching for her. After 3 days of going out, calling, searching, and getting no actual replies when I was out there, I finally realized something. Those mews I had been hearing did not sound right. There was something completely off about them, and I had been able to ignore that until I began to hear frantic cries from the cat in the desert. Sneaking out once again, I just stood near the entrance, calling and looking around, while my dog sniffed at an old abandoned mattress. It was around sunset, and honestly I did not like being out there when all I could see were shadows and just a few feet in front of me. I stayed there for 10 minutes until I started hearing what I thought were troublemakers trying to scare me, or at least trying to sneak up on me for whatever reason. So I quickly scooped up my dog and dashed back inside the community walls, making my way back home, literally across the entrance from the desert, a hole in a brick wall. That night was filled with the mews outside my window, and they kept sounding wrong, like distorted. I was very grateful that I remembered to shut my curtains, because I did not want to see what was making those noises, because it was not my cat. 2 hours later, the meowing finally stopped, but when I looked at the window, I could see the shadow of a face pressed against it. As I looked at the face, I heard strange, distorted cries again. Suddenly, without warning, the face turned, and then the figure disappeared. Soon after that, I heard the footsteps and talking from kids outside the window. Something was mimicking voices. The next day, I decided to spend a week at my grandmother's to get away. It felt like I was losing my mind. The first few nights were pretty normal and quiet, until one early morning I was standing near my older cousin's window, and I heard those same meows again. So I woke up my cousin, and she said she could hear them too. I don't like when people can see or hear things I'm dealing with, because that makes it more real, and that was something I couldn't deny anymore. While at my grandma's, I would usually sit outside late and visit with my cousin's 2 cats until she got home from work. However, for the last few nights I was there, I did not feel safe continuing my routine and waiting outside. One night I was foolish, and I waited outside, and I could hear chirping and meowing from the golf course across from my grandma's house. The sounds did not stop until I hid behind one of the pillars on her porch and stood motionless. I've been home for 2 days now, and whatever that is stays outside my window, torturing me. I refuse to walk my dog at night unless someone is with me, and I have never returned to the desert. Every now and then I'll hear a whisper and book it back into the house. I'm praying and hoping that this is just someone's sick joke, but my grandma believes it's a skinwalker. We've even found a few footprints outside my window after it had rained, and the strangest part is, they start out animal and slowly become human. I feel like I'm slowly going insane. I live in a little town in New Mexico. This town is surrounded by dirt roads, dairies, and fields. There is a state park about 10 to 15 minutes outside of town. One day, my boyfriend and I were at this park, and must have been around 3 in the morning. We didn't really have anywhere else to hang out, so we would often go there to have some private time. We were about to leave, and we came up to this little intersection where the entrances were, and we see a vehicle turning in. So we sat and waited for the vehicle to pass, but the closer it came, the slower it got. It was a bit unnerving. I was getting nervous because we do have gangs out here. As the car approached, we noticed that the driver was an old lady. She was a tiny thing, with curly white hair. And this is when things got weird. Remember, she's going very slow, so we got plenty of time to soak in this image of the lady. As she passed, she turned her head towards us. Her eyes were solid black. I swear to God, there were no whites to her eyes. Not like empty sockets, but as if she had black eyeballs, or maybe like each eye was just one solid pupil. We both froze as she slowly drove past. All the while, we were both filled with fear and dread. I'm not sure what we saw, but there were so many unanswered questions. Why would a little old woman be at the park 15 minutes outside of town at 3 in the morning? What was she doing there? Why was she driving so slow and just staring at us the whole time? We were very weirded out, and we started questioning what we saw, making excuses that we were just maybe tired, even though we both know what we saw. Well, a few months later, we drove out to the dirt roads to get away for a little bit. The sun was just setting. I knew we should have went home as soon as it got dark, but we decided to park and chill out. Suddenly, we both saw something out of the corner of our eyes. Instantly, we both jerked our heads around to see what it was. It was humanoid in shape, dirty with very long legs, but it ran on all fours. It looked more like a person trying to run on all fours, because when it ran, it just didn't look right. At an unnatural speed, it ran into the field next to us, and in a split second, it was gone. We were both so freaked out by this experience that we started the car and left immediately. New Mexico has many stories about skinwalkers, but I've never really paid attention or tried to believe those stories. I thought it was just native superstition. But when we mentioned these stories to a couple of friends, they all began to open up about the weird things they've seen out on those dirt roads. After hearing those stories, after what we saw those nights, we have not been out driving like that again in a while, because now it just seems too dangerous. Who knows what those fields are hiding? Based on the stories of the skinwalkers, I believe either of these sightings could be those menacing eyes of the old woman. It could have been a skinwalker wearing the skin suit of an old lady. Anyway, we're definitely not going to take any more chances out there. The last thing I want is to be out in the forest alone as something watches me through the brush.
I've always had a sort of draw to the supernatural, and this story is about an encounter I had with a skinwalker. I live in southern New Jersey, very close to the Pine Barrens, home of the Jersey Devil. I'm sure you've heard of him. My backyard is pretty big. It has a large deck and a pretty big fenced-in yard. The fence backs up to a wooded area. There was always deer running around back there, owls, and even bats. On this particular night, I awoke out of a deep sleep to a tapping noise on my window. I had to have been about 8 years old at the time, and the constant presence of spirits in my room was enough for me to be too scared to investigate any sort of noise in the middle of the night. So I stayed put, just shivering under my covers, not quite sure what to do. I peeked through the blankets just enough to see what looked like a tall, thin figure standing at my window. You see, my room was in the middle of my house, and my window faced the wooded area just behind it. I waited a couple of minutes, and the tapping eventually stopped. Then, not a moment later, I heard a voice calling my name, a familiar voice. It was my mother's, but at the same time it wasn't. It sounded so scripted. I heard more tapping and the voice still calling, but the voice slowly drifted to the back door. The back door was in the kitchen, and it led out to the deck. I mustered the courage to get up, and I tiptoed to the edge of the kitchen doorway. I know I saw a figure at the back door window in the shape of a woman. It was tapping at the glass and calling my name and my mother's voice still. "Kelly, dear, please let me inside," that thing said to me. It sounded as if it was projecting the voice straight into my head. I was a smart kid though. I tiptoed to my mother's room and I quietly opened the door. And there she was in bed, softly snoring. I noped my way right back into bed, and I hid under my covers. Sure enough, the tapping at my window started again, but I did not dare look. Eventually, I fell asleep to the tapping, and when I woke up in the morning, I told my mom what had happened. She frowned at me and rubbed my head, sighing. "You have such an imagination," she smiled, and continued doing whatever she was doing. I went outside the next day in the morning, and there were footprints on the ground where my window was. I showed my mom, yet she was still skeptical, but she let me sleep in her bed that night, and we said a prayer together before we went to sleep. That was the only time that ever happened, and I hope I never have to see that thing again, the thing that I believe was a skinwalker. I had the great honor of meeting not one but two skinwalkers at the same time. Let me go over the landscape first. From where I was, to the right of me was an open grass field, and next to the grass field was the community college I would be later attending. To the other side of me on the left was a golf course that intertwines with a small forest and path going around. I've been on that path several times before, always getting this weird feeling that something wasn't right about it. It was off, just not right. I was out doing what I usually do during summer nights, walking around listening to music. Because it was summer, the nights were nice and cool. All I needed was a t-shirt and a pair of cargo shorts, plus my favorite hat and shoes. It was about 12:30 at night when I was passing the golf course near my house. I got the feeling that something was watching me. Of course, I've gotten this feeling before, but it felt stronger this night. So I stopped, and I looked around several times to see if there was someone other than myself outside. Spotting no one, I took out my headphones to listen, hoping I could find out that way. It was then that I realized it was way too quiet. The sounds of nature were gone. No sounds of cars in the distance like there usually was. Certainly there should have been some sort of noise, but I heard absolutely nothing. It was very chilling. I stayed still for a moment, thinking. Then I remembered that I had brought my flashlight with me. Being delighted that I had brought it, I reached down to my pocket and pulled it out. If something was there, I was hoping to catch its glowing eyes in the flashlight beam. When I clicked on the flashlight beam, almost instantly, I saw these glowing eyes. I stood stock still as I stared at what was before me. I did not expect two pairs of glowing orange eyes, staring right at me. I've never seen eyes like that. They were almost literally glowing orange. Not sure what to do other than stay still as possible. I just stared right back at them. It was then that I noticed how high the pair of eyes were off of the ground. They were maybe 7 feet from the ground. Holy crap, I thought. What kind of animal stands that tall around here? I noticed that they never blinked even once. It was extremely creepy, and I kept hoping that it was some sort of trick of the eyes. I stood there for what felt like 10 minutes, staring back at these creepy eyes. I was trying to think of what I could do. I did not want to get any closer than what I was, and I didn't want to risk getting attacked by whatever this thing was. If I kept going along the path, I'd be going right past it. Running might have been my only option. With that on my mind, I slowly started to turn my back so it was facing the field, my flashlight still on the glowing eyes. I was very cautious, very slow. I took baby steps, one at a time. When I thought I got far enough away from that thing, I decided to walk a bit faster. I wanted to get a good head start ahead of this thing before it ever decided to give chase. Before I turned off my flashlight and put it back in my pocket, I remembered that my music was still going. I looked down for a second, and I saw that my earbuds were hanging out of my shirt, and I've always hated them like that while running. So I decided to put them back in to listen to music, whatever would take my mind off of things. As soon as they were back in my ears and my flashlight was back in my pocket, I made a mad dash for home. I was going so fast that my hat almost flew off. So I quickly turned the hat around so it didn't fall, and I continued to sprint. I just kept telling myself to ignore it, to run faster and faster, and then I did the one thing you don't want to do. I looked behind me. I'm curious by default, so of course I looked behind me to see if whatever it was had given chase. And what do you know? It did. But it confused me. From the short glimpse I got of it, it looked to be a really large coyote, borderline wolf size. The sight of it made my adrenaline rush, and I pumped my legs to go even faster. When I glanced back again, there were 2 of them, both keeping up and following me. As I approached my house with these things still telling me, I was thinking of the fastest way to enter the house. I did not want to be outside too long trying to get in, so I decided going through the garage would be my best bet. Again, I looked behind me, and I didn't see anything, but I was not about to relax. As soon as I got up to the garage, I pushed in the code and opened it just enough to get under the door. I rushed over to the other side to close it. I finally felt a bit safe, and my adrenaline was wearing down. At that point, my lungs were burning as if they were on fire. I was gasping for air, slumping to the ground, just sitting there for a moment. For a long time after this, I wondered what I saw, even if they were the biggest coyotes in existence, or actual wolves where there shouldn't be. That doesn't explain those orange eyes. No animal has eyes like that. It was far from natural. When I was a child, I remember playing hide and seek with my friends, who I still talk to this day. But it was back then that we stopped playing hide and seek, because something happened. My house was backed by a forest of pine trees, so there wasn't a whole lot of brush, and you could see about a mile in. Keep in mind we were about 3 miles away from any other houses, so it was often very quiet. As well as being very creepy at night, it also seemed very eerie during the day. I always got chills when I was out there. Yet that didn't stop us from camping, hunting, and just playing in the woods. So one summer evening, myself, my mom, dad, and friends, Jeff and Lily, had gone out to camp. What was special about this time was the fact that we went deeper than we've ever been into these woods. After hiking out, we set up camp, and by then it was already getting dark. We whined to my parents to let us play for almost 10 minutes until they said fine. So it was about 8, and it was dark out. We got some flashlights and we began our games. Of course, like always, I counted first. I began counting, all the while hearing giggles and running feet behind me. After 30 seconds, I turned and I listened. Now, keep in mind, it was summer. You should hear birds, frogs, and crickets. But at the time, I heard nothing. Not wanting to seem like a wuss, I sucked it up and started seeking. After a minute or so, I heard movement, and I instantly saw something that would scar me for the rest of my life. I saw a tall, pale creature, about 8 feet tall, and it was still hunched over. Its limbs were thin and elongated, with long, bony fingernails. Its hair was white and thin. The moment I saw it, I screamed so loud. It turned to me, and this thing, it actually spoke. It said to me, "Hush, child. I don't want to hurt you." Now, being a 12-year-old, I had some sense that I knew this thing was going to kill me. I tried to move, but I was completely petrified, so afraid that I could barely breathe. While stuck in a staring contest with this yellow-eyed creature, I tried to remember my way back. The second it took a step toward me, I grabbed my flashlight, and I bolted back the way I came. As I was running, I could hear this thing behind me. I turned to see the spot where our camp had been, only to see the remnants of a fire. So instead, I headed home. When I was a few feet away from my yard, I hit a root and fell flat on my face. And I thought, honestly, that I was dead. But as I fell, my dad came out with a shotgun and screamed every possible swear out into the woods. Now, this whole time, I didn't hear footsteps behind me. I just ran. But then as I lay there facing my house, facing my father, only inches behind me, I heard the same voice as before. "I'll be seeing you soon." I nearly fainted right there when I realized how close it had come to me. The voice was only a few inches behind me. As soon as I could get myself back up, I ran inside, running into my mother's arms and crying. Apparently, my family had seen this creature in the forest before me. They were unable to find me, and having to care for the other children, they had to get home fast. They had left me. A week later, we moved closer to the city, and we ditched all of our outdoor gear. I remember something a week later. We set up a trail cam, but no one dared to go out there. Ever since that night, I've been wondering what we saw. And to my understanding from my research, I think we may have seen a skinwalker. Mostly, I'm just glad to be alive, and I will never be going out there to see that thing again. I've never been a person to think that skinwalkers are real. That is, until 1 week ago. Last week I went camping with my mom. We were at Strawberry, Arizona, if I remember correctly. We were going to be camping for the weekend, starting Friday night to Sunday afternoon. We arrived at about 6 o'clock and it was already dark. My mom started a small fire and we got working on putting up our tents. We were done about 30 minutes later. We had our dinner, some s'mores, and went to bed. I woke up at 10. I needed to go use the bathroom, so I got out a flashlight and went to pee. A few moments later, I began to walk back to my tent. I heard something scratching on what I assumed was wood. I stopped and I looked around, but there was nothing there. I jogged back to my tent and got in, and only a few moments later, that scratching came again, but it was closer now, way closer. After a minute or two, it went away, and I went to sleep a few minutes later. I was awoken to a loud screech. It sounded like it was within 20 feet of us. I didn't dare go out there with whatever that thing was. I was still half asleep, so I turned on my flashlight and I pointed it to the walls of the tent. Big mistake. It was attracted to the light and it walked towards it. I saw the silhouette of the thing come into view. It was a very large figure. Everything about it seemed human at first, and then I noticed the fingers on this thing. They looked to be claws. The height of it was larger than any person I've ever seen, and its legs weren't human either. There looked to be a fur about them, as if it was some sort of goat. It started scratching on my tent, creating holes in it. I saw a part of the tall figure. Its legs were, as I described before, goat-like. I did what anyone would do in this situation. I screamed. The thing scratched at my leg, and then the creature started to shrink. This is the best way I can describe it. And only a moment later it took on the form of a wolf. But still, on its back legs, the thing took off. Immediately I got a first aid kit, and I wrapped my leg up. The damage wasn't too bad. The cut itself wasn't that deep, but it did bleed for a while. After that, I got out of my tent and went to my mom's. I told her that we needed to leave now, and within 15 minutes, everything was in the car, and we drove out of that place. It was probably 3 in the morning whenever this happened, and we made it home only a couple of hours later.
What I'm about to tell you happened 2 weeks ago. I was going on a trip to my grandparents' place, and that's about a 1-hour drive. The road leads through a huge forest and nearly 45 minutes of the drive there. So I left with my parents at around 6 that night, and it was almost completely dark. So through the whole drive it was going to be night, I assumed. Half an hour went by and it was pitch black outside, and only our car's headlights and the moon's light were giving any light at all. Suddenly, as I was watching through the windows, I will mention that we were going slow just to avoid any slippery turns, I saw something, and I instantly regretted looking out that window. There in the dark of the woods was a pale white, almost human-like figure, and only by the light of the moon I could make out some features on its face. Then it moved its head towards our vehicle. I saw 2 red eyes. They were like portals directly to hell. I was terrified instantly. The creature let out a high-pitched screech that I could hear from within the car, and I knew that it was coming from this creature, because as it started, its jaw widened inhumanly so. My mom and dad turned their heads trying to find the source of the noise. They heard it too. After looking at my parents to see if they heard it, I looked back at the creature. It was now no longer sunk to the ground. It was now standing on its legs and was easily about 7 feet tall. The moment my dad saw it, he decided to throw caution out the window. He floored it. Then we watched as the creature got back on all 4s, then charged into the woods, disappearing. Now this was a one-way road, and it went on straight for a few miles. But I swear the whole way, the same distance from the tree line to the road, we heard those screams over and over. Apparently, this creature was somehow keeping pace with us. When we finally arrived at my grandparents' place, we all got in the house as quickly as possible, completely forgetting any luggage that we had in the vehicle. Inside, we rushed through salutations, and we locked the door. And then we heard the screaming around the house. My grandparents' expressions were different than that of my parents, and instantly we all knew that my grandparents recognized this sound. The next few hours went by as we all sat in the living room, cuddled up together, and my dad and grandfather both had 12-gauge shotguns at the ready. After a long while, I somehow finally fell asleep. That night, though, I kept waking up in the middle of the night, over and over, every so often. But every time I did, I would look out the window, and there would be red eyes in different windows. Whatever was out there, it was moving from window to window, keeping a close eye on us, or maybe it was trying to find an entrance. When everyone was awake in the morning, everything seemed to go back to normal, and during our little getaway, we didn't hear anything or see anything else like that creature. I couldn't have been more thankful. To this day, I don't know what it was, but one fact remains. My grandparents know something, but they refuse to give any answers. This all happened one day when I went to spend the day with one of my friends. We'll call him David. David is one of my closest friends and has been for the past 7 or 8 years. We grew up in church together and would always beg our parents to let us go to each other's houses after our Sunday services. But that all changed about a couple of years ago. It was July 1st of 2010. David was having a sleepover for his 9th birthday, and I was invited. Now, before I begin this story, I would like to explain the layout of his property, which will be important further into this story. His house is set on a flat level field, and it's about a quarter-mile from the nearest house. The backyard is very wide and stretches all the way to the tree line behind the house. They had a swing set for his younger brother set up just a few meters away from the tree line. I arrived at his house at about 4 o'clock. The party did not start until about 4:30, so I was a bit early. He and I decided to go outside to shoot his BB gun to wait for the others to arrive. He dragged an old barrel out from his father's tool shed. Then we put 4 empty cans on top of the barrel and had at it. We were outside for about half an hour, and we soon saw that other people were arriving, so we thought we would head inside. It was a great time, and before we knew it, we were all passed out. That night, though, I woke up around 12. And I did not know what woke me up. I was confused, as it was still dark out. I just assumed it was my instinct to get up and use the bathroom, but I didn't really have to go that bad. I decided to go downstairs and grab a drink of water, since I was really thirsty. Besides, maybe that's what woke me up. I got a glass of water and began to head back upstairs, when I noticed the slightest movement outside of the kitchen window. I brushed it off, though. I assumed it was a cat or something, maybe an animal of the night, and I continued to head back upstairs. When I got back upstairs, I opened the bedroom door, and immediately I noticed that David was standing right in front of his bedroom window. I asked him, "Is everything all right?" But there was no response. I was a bit weirded out by this, so I slowly walked backwards and shut the door. I turned my head to the right and down the hallway, and I noticed the bathroom light was on. I walked down the hallway and knocked on the door. From the other side, I heard someone say, "Yes?" And it was David's voice. This instantly freaked me out, because there was no possible way he could have gotten from the bedroom to the bathroom in that amount of time without me seeing him. So I asked him, I thought you were in your room." He replied, "No, I've been in here the whole time you were downstairs." I waited for him to get out. After that, I was not about to go anywhere alone. I began to explain to him everything that had happened, and I think he was as freaked out as I was. So he and I decided to go downstairs and watch TV, since his other friends were asleep and we did not want to wake them. We watched some late-night episodes of Fresh Prince and just chilled downstairs for the time being. I was just about to fall asleep again when I heard a thud coming from the window directly behind me facing the backyard. At that moment, I was hesitant to turn around and see what was there. I did, though, but I saw nothing. Just the dark tree line and the moon shining on all the tall pines and bright green grass outside. Honestly, I just knew something was off. I woke up David, and I asked him if he would go outside with me to investigate the noise I heard. He agreed, though hesitantly, and we both walked quietly to the patio in the back where the noise had been coming from. We didn't go all the way out, due to the fact that it was so dark and we had no flashlights with us. We didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but I soon noticed a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, just standing there staring at us. I could very well make out their silhouette due to the moon shining behind it. I was more than scared by this, so I pushed David to go back inside. We both stood at the glass door watching this thing standing there. He and I both could feel the air become very dreadful, and we smelled the worst smell you could possibly imagine. It suddenly surrounded us and smelled of rotten eggs and burnt flesh, but much stronger. I could see this figure start moving towards us, but in the most bizarre way. It almost looked like a drunk person walking, but at a steady pace, almost in rhythmic form. Right, left, left. As they got closer, we could slowly start making out facial features. Honestly, I wish I had never seen it, because it was the most horrific and disgusting thing I've ever seen. And it was beyond human. Well, at least the face looked human, but beyond that, the head looked like a goat. It had hooves and antlers like you would see on a buck, and it gave off such an evil vibe that I could barely look at it. It didn't take long for David and I to book it back upstairs, screaming like little girls and waking everyone up. We told everyone what we saw when they began to ask, but our parents were not as impressed. Everyone else, though, believed us. To this day, I still believe it was a skinwalker. But every time I tell the story to someone, they convince me it was just my imagination. But I know for a fact that it wasn't, and I know what me and David saw that night was real. To this day, when I ask David about it, he gets this cold sweat and becomes extremely nervous, exactly like I do, every time I think back on that moment. One time, me, my sister, my mom, and her boyfriend went camping around 4 hours from our house. We've gone camping well over 40 times before at least, so I have a bit of experience. Me and my mom's boyfriend, let's call him Chris, arrived before my mom and sister. Let's call my sister Leela. This wasn't much of a problem because everyone knew the area very well, so Chris and I did the usual. We gathered firewood and set up the equipment. I was pretty big for my age, and it took a lot for me to get cold, so people knew if I complained about it being cold, everyone else was already freezing. I am an avid hunter, and I'm very protective of my friends and family. So around 10 o'clock at night, when I was just about to go to sleep, my mom, Leela, and my 3 dogs arrived at the campsite. My mom asked me to help unload some stuff, and once we did, not too long after, we went to sleep. Me and my dog Lucy woke up at the same time, somewhere around 3 in the morning. Believe me when I say it was freezing cold. But not a few seconds after waking up, I heard a distorted voice of my mom saying, "Come help me." I was extremely tired, and I didn't want to. I knew I'd get in trouble if I didn't, though. This was a big mistake. I put my shoes on and I looked up to the cars, expecting to see my mom, and even though my vision was a bit blurry still, I saw something black and hairy hunched over on top of my car. I thought it was a bear, and in fear I pulled out the knife in my sheath. I was about to start yelling at the thing to ward it off, when it started laughing at me. I froze. My dog began to growl and the creature stood up, and it mimicked Lucy's growl. She whimpered. Then this creature jumped from the car to 7 feet in front of me and let out a shriek so loud that my head hurt. I could hear everyone else waking up in their tents. Chris came out seconds later with his loaded gun. This thing looked at him. Half asleep as well, Chris shot at the thing, and before I knew it, it had run off back into the woods. We ended up calling for help. This thing had scared the hell out of all of us. Even if it was just a bear, this thing was really close and threatened us, basically. When the Fish and Wildlife Services got there, they took whatever samples they could find. We never really got an answer. But being Native American, I've always heard stories, so the word skinwalker quickly came to mind on our way home. I was 15 years old, and I thought I was invincible. My mom forced me to go to the Boy Scouts, and it was my first campout with them. Now, before this campout, I already had a good amount of badges and was strong and sporty, but I was always up for something new. While we piled into the truck and were driven to the campsite, I still remember what the camp looked like. It was filled with chipped pieces of wood and was surrounded by forest. We started off with the usual, making a fire and playing manhunt with more people my age. As the sun began to set and our scoutmasters, let's call them Benjamin and Thomas, told us older kids to go into the forest and find some food, such as rabbits or birds to eat. So we went into the damp forest, unsupervised. We all split up so we could cover more ground. I decided to find some rabbit holes. I'd been around this area before with my parents, never camping though, so I knew where some rabbit holes were. I began to hum to myself as I walked. This is when I first saw something. In the distance, behind a tree, there was the silhouette of a deer with antlers. The antlers had many points, so I assumed it was a large buck. The thing was standing still, as if it was trying to listen. I never once saw it move, so I continued to walk slowly closer, thinking it'd be cool if I could get as close as possible to a wild deer. But as I gained some perspective on this creature, as the tree moved from my view, I realized that this was nothing natural. This was no ordinary animal. What I was seeing looked to be something standing on two legs, with a deer's head at the top, but the whole thing was all skin, leathery black skin, and this thing wasn't listening. It just had its head tilted down, facing the forest floor, as if it was a statue. I began to reason with myself that maybe it was some crazy artwork by some stranger. But then I saw it breathe. Without chancing it, without taking another step towards it, I turned around and I ran back to camp. I was so afraid that I was staggering and tripping the whole way. When I got back, I was too afraid to tell anyone. I just wanted to go home. I didn't know if anyone would believe me, but I know what I saw. This happened around 2 years ago during the summer. I had stayed with my uncle due to family reasons. He was very into our heritage, as he was a Native American and all. We had stayed near a reservation. I think it was about 3 miles away from his house. He lived in North Carolina, where he owned a bit of land. The natives have been hosting a sort of festival. It was to spread their beliefs about the conservation of the forest used as farmlands. One day I asked him about it, thinking it would be a fun way to bond with each other. And we went. Though the whole time I was there, I felt like I was being watched. Even up to a week after the festival, I could not shake the feeling of being watched, no matter what I did. Late one night, we were out driving in my uncle's old Ford truck. We were on a back road next to the reservation, and of course there were no streetlights. We were on the edge of a big forest. Soon we saw what looked like a deer in the road. It jumped out of the way quickly, so we never saw exactly what it was. Oddly enough, though, my uncle, with a very worried look on his face, stopped the truck. He stared off into the woods, trying to get a good look at whatever it was. A minute or so later, something heavy landed in the bed of our truck, and it weighed the car down and shook it. My first reaction, as anyone would do, was to turn my head and see what was back there. But my uncle wouldn't let me. He pushed my head down so that I would not be able to look up, and then he sped off. My head faced the floor of the vehicle, but I could hear the noises in the bed of the truck move to the roof, and I could hear scratching and screeching noises. It was easily the most chilling sound I've ever heard. Eventually, after about 10 minutes, whatever it was jumped out of the bed. I could tell, because when the weight was lifted, the truck bounced back up, and the truck drove a bit easier. Whatever was back there must have been really heavy. Eventually, back at the house, I asked my uncle what had happened, and he explained to me, in a very solemn voice, that it was indeed a skinwalker. He had forced my head down because looking into their eyes meant certain death. And let's just say it was a secret we kept between us, and I now share this secret with you.
My friends and I love paranormal stuff, and we love being scared. We practically study this stuff. So by now we know about wendigos, skinwalkers, and many other demons. But until this one night, we never really knew what being scared meant. That night was about 3 weeks ago, when me and my friends decided to go into the forest in my backyard. There were 3 of us, me, T, and Josh. They were staying the night at my house when Josh came up with the idea to go for a walk in the woods. This was surprising to T and I, as he was usually the one that was scared. He said it'd be fun to try to creep ourselves out in the dark. We agreed and got some flashlights, then headed out in my backyard. Now, in my backyard, there was no fence separating the forest. The forest was huge, and I still haven't seen the end of it from my usual walks, and that's even during the daytime. We all walked close together for about 5 minutes, when things started to happen. All of our flashlights began blinking and then just shut off. This couldn't have just been the batteries, because it happened at the same time. What the heck?" we heard Josh say. Then he just took off back to the house. "Oh my God, Josh," I said under my breath. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind us. I turned toward it, trying to turn my flashlight on again, but nothing happened. T stepped closer to me as we both stared into the dark forest in silence. I wanted to run, but something held me back, maybe a morbid curiosity. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the darkness, but soon I could see what made that twig snap. It was a tall creature with a hunched back. The ribs of this beast were showing, with flesh hanging from it. The head was of a deer skull, and instantly I knew what this might be. Perhaps a skinwalker or wendigo. It was like seeing something straight from your nightmares, something so unreal that you deny that you're seeing it. But it was there, so vivid. I'll never forget the sight of it. Honestly, things like wendigos and skinwalkers and creatures like that, they were just stories before. But now the story came to life before me, and I was scared for my life. I nearly screamed at the sight of it, but I tried to hold it in, trying not to make eye contact with it. I whispered to T, "You need to run as soon as I do." I was far from sure of myself, but I thought maybe we could run fast enough to get back to my house before it got to us. So I bolted. T took off right toward the house, but my plan was to cut off in a different direction before I headed home. That way at least one of us could make it. Not too long after that, though, I began to hear footsteps behind me, and my heart began to race. As those footsteps caught up to me, I turned to face my fate. But there was Josh with a different flashlight. I'd never been more thankful to see him. "Holy crap, dude, are you okay?" he asked me. "Man, we saw something." The look on his face said he didn't completely believe me, but he replied to me, "I just came back to look for you guys to make sure you're okay." Still completely terrified, I looked back deeper into the forest behind me when an ear-piercing screech broke through the air. I wanted to just be home. I've never heard anything like this before, and it sent chills down my body. Josh and I ran as fast as we could towards T in the house, but whenever we looked behind us, we heard footsteps coming from something else. We just kept running as fast as we could, with something trailing close behind us, when suddenly my head caught an overhanging branch, and it knocked me to the ground. Josh mustn't have seen, because he just kept running. I lay there on the forest floor, scared, tired, and now in pain. I was too afraid to look behind me. I just knew that I would see that thing standing over me, waiting to kill me. Thankfully, the next thing I saw was T running through the bush, back towards me. He actually came back for me. Before I could be filled with hope, though, T stopped in his tracks before he could reach me. He knelt down, and he didn't once take his eyes off of something behind me. His eyes were so wide and his mouth was open. What was he seeing? He looked so scared. It was almost more terrifying than actually seeing this thing, just knowing that it was right behind me. Then those same footsteps that were following us before, I heard them again, but this time, they were walking away. I wanted to survive this. This was my chance. I got up and I sprinted to the house, T just barely in front of me. The whole way there, we didn't see or hear anything else. When we got back to the house, Josh was waiting at the back door, with his head barely poking out of it. I rolled my eyes when I saw him, but none of us said another word for the rest of the night. We got inside, locked all the doors, and just sat there. We all waited for the sun to come up, the three of us in silent agreement that we should probably never go back in those woods again. I live in Utah, and it's one of the most overlooked states, but that doesn't mean it hasn't had its fair share of monster sightings and paranormal experiences. Anyway, my family goes camping every summer for 5 days in Ashley National Forest up in the high Uintas. So my family arrived at the campsite at around 10:30 p.m. It would have been darker out if it had not been for the huge bonfire my family made. So I was setting up my tent when I saw two red eyes in the trees nearby. It startled me, but I didn't panic. I really didn't have any reason to be concerned. It was just some animal in the woods. Therefore, I didn't pay it much mind. Later the next morning, I was curious. So I walked over to the spot where the eyes were, and I saw deep hoofprints of a deer in the ground. There was a massive population of deer around here, so there was nothing wrong with this. I ignored it and went to breakfast. A few nights later, on the last night, I asked my cousin if she would go to the bathroom with me, and she said yes. As she and I were walking to the outhouse, we saw what looked like a goat on the side of the mountain. We thought this was odd because we had never seen goats up here before, and this didn't look like a mountain goat at all. So we went on to the bathroom, but when we came back from it, we saw the goat again, but this time it was facing us. And that's when we saw the brightest red eyes we'd ever seen. They were so similar to the ones I'd seen on the first night. Creeped out, we walked slowly away from this weird animal, but all the way back to camp I could feel those eyes on me. The next morning we decided to go fishing before we left, so we packed up everything and picked a spot to fish on the river. Keep in mind that this is Indian territory, which is already a dumb idea because we could have gotten fined. But we headed out anyway and caught a lot of fish. So after we were done fishing, my cousin and I spotted something in the brush along the edge of the forest nearby. And sure enough, there were those same red eyes. But this time it wasn't from a goat or a deer. All we could make out was a pale, skinny figure that was both human and inhuman at the same time. But I'll never forget those eyes. They were the same eyes as before. My cousin and I just stared at the thing when it finally broke the silence. It bellowed this ear-piercing scream. And that's when we began to book it back to the campground as fast as we could. But the thing was chasing us through the undergrowth. Whatever it was gaining on us fast, but we could see the campground, so we booked it even harder. Soon, we got to the camp, and the thing was nowhere to be seen. It was gone, but not before giving one final ear-piercing screech. My friend and I don't talk about what we saw often, but we know it to be real, and we both believe it was a skinwalker.
My family and I were going to a family reunion on my uncle's ranch or farm. Every 5 years we would have the reunion, and every time I would awkwardly follow my parents around and stuff, talking to cousins that I've never met before. Anyway, some of the grown-ups decided it was a good idea to stay and spend the night, drinking. My parents decided to stay too, and I don't know what possessed them to put me in charge of the toddlers and teenagers, but those kids were like half my age, and 2 of them were older than me. I wasn't really up to it. Somehow we ended up sleeping outside in tents that were in a row, overlooking the thick bushes and trees outside. It was about 1 in the morning when all of us finally went to sleep, because last I checked all the phone lights were off. I woke up listening to eerie howls of pain coming from behind one of the tents. Now howls like this were normal, because there were a lot of coyotes on my uncle's ranch, but they wouldn't come this close to humans. I ended up listening to the howl. It slowly died off. I woke up again later, listening to the sound of odd ripping noises to the left. I got up and peeked my head outside of the tent, and what I saw shook me to my very soul. It looked like a deer on its hind legs, until I took a second glance. There, looming over a tent only a few feet away from me, was a tall and gray creature with dangling arms and horns on its head. It was just peering into a hole it made on the top of a tent. I wanted to scream and do something, but I was paralyzed with fear as this thing put half its head into the tent hole. I never realized that my cousin was up and looking at this thing until she threw a small pebble at it. I pushed her back inside and closed the tent we were huddled in. We sat there listening and waiting for it to do something. We could hear it out there sniffing the tent, and we could still see its tall shadow. It was just circling the tent for a while, until we heard another howl off in the distance. Finally, this weird creature scattered away like it never happened. We stayed up until dawn, and I was too tired and scared to go tell our parents what happened. The last thing I was about to do was exit that tent. In the morning, some tents were ripped, and there was what appeared to be drool on some of the tents. I never got around to telling my parents what I experienced. I don't know why I still haven't. I really haven't bothered to share this story with many people. Maybe I'm still scared, deep down. I'm a young woman from a remote part of Western Australia. I'm surrounded by thousands of kilometers of farmland and bushland, forest if you're not familiar with the term bush, and we have a large variety of native wildlife on our farm and in surrounding bushlands. Anyway, on to the story. Every day after work, I walk my 2 border collies through a selected bush track, which is roughly 10 kilometers long as a way to unwind from my crappy job. I've seen some very creepy things in there before, such as dead kittens and livestock, which have been dumped by farmers and thrown across logs in a creepy fashion, but that's nothing compared to what I saw on this day. It is important to note that since we are so rural here, there's a severe lack of people, but sometimes I still pass a camper or two, and sometimes even someone growing drugs out in the remote bush. So, as I was walking my dogs late last year in the middle of summer, I was surprised when my 2 dogs stopped and began to growl. I could see the hair on the back of their necks began to stand up. I thought that it may have just been a kangaroo or a feral pig, as my younger dog gets quite worked up when they're around. This thought quickly faded when I felt cold, and I broke out in goosebumps, even though it was a hot 37 degrees Celsius outside. A couple of seconds after the temperature dropped, I rounded the corner, and there was a little girl standing in the middle of the bush trail, and suddenly seeing someone there scared me. The little girl was looking in the opposite direction with her back to me and looked around 7 years old by her height. She had dirty blonde medium-length hair, a plain red shirt, and black shorts. As I was about to laugh to myself about letting this little girl scare me, who was probably just camping with her parents, the girl turned, and she looked at me. This was no girl. Her eyes were solid black. Not black as in contact black, but a hollow, lifeless black. This thing opened its mouth and let out an ear-splitting howl. It turned and ran back on all fours into the bush. Needless to say, I hightailed it out of there, dragging my poor, cowering, frightened farm dogs, and ran for about 6 kilometers. I was completely filled with fear and covered in goosebumps, and I felt adrenaline rush inside me. My lungs were burning and my legs ached and my head spun. After about another 2 kilometers, I finally got home. I ran inside and locked the dogs and myself in my bedroom. I was too scared to come out to even eat dinner. After that, I did not walk through that bush for a month. But since walking again, I have not experienced anything out of the ordinary. I've been walking this bush since I was 10 years old, and I've never experienced anything like this before. I'm sharing this with you, trying to figure out what I saw. Judging by the feral look in her eyes and the way she scurried away, perhaps it was an Australian skinwalker, a native aboriginal spirit, disguised as a little girl. Or maybe, if I'm lucky, it was just some really effed up prank played by some campers. Either way, I'll never walk through the bush the same way again. It was the last day of school for Easter, and I was excited for it, until I had a bit of an accident. I ran headfirst into the mirror on a truck, and I ended up having to go to the hospital. I spent a whole day and the next morning there, but I was soon feeling a bit better. So the night before Easter, my cousin and I were walking to the nearest gas station to buy a few snacks and some junk food. I noticed on my right was a small patch of woods. My cousin then spoke up and said, "Dude, we should go in there." I just looked at him like he was a madman. But I agreed to go. Maybe it was just peer pressure. Boy, was that a bad idea. For one, my injury was making my head hurt. And then, when we walked about 50 yards in, I began to hear something that sounded like something eating or thrashing at meat. I told this to my friend, and he told me to remain calm, that it was probably a bobcat or a coyote. I told him in this part of Michigan there's rarely anything like that. Then he said maybe it's a wolverine or something. But then again, this far north, I thought to myself, that's not likely. We ventured on though, trying to ignore the sound. Later, I hear something that sounded like my cousin, but he's right next to me. But coming from the trees nearby, I hear his same voice. Dude, come over here. We both stopped in our tracks, now completely petrified. We both knew that that wasn't him. I could even see the look of terror on his face when he heard it. As we sat there thinking silently, wondering what we should do, we then saw something of a silhouette dart between trees in front of us. We turned tail and ran back to the gas station. But before we exited those woods, we could see the same silhouette darting between trees around us. Whatever it was easily keeping pace with us, and it seemed to be just toying with us. We ran harder, pushing ourselves to the limits. We didn't stop until we made it back to his house. There, we tried to take our minds off of things. We didn't feel tired after that. We stayed up playing video games and watching videos. The next morning, my mom picked me up, and I couldn't be happier to get away from those woods. Needless to say, I won't be going back to that patch of woods.